The snow was coming down so hard that David could barely see the road ahead. His windshield wipers were working overtime, but it felt like fighting a losing battle. After 16 straight hours at the hospital, all he wanted was to get home, grab a hot shower, and collapse into bed. David had been a paramedic for 8 years now, and he'd seen his share of tough days. But today had been especially brutal. 3 car accidents, 2 heart attacks, and 1 kitchen fire that left a family. Homeless just before Christmas, his body ached, his eyes burned, and his coffee had gone cold hours ago. The radio crackled with weather warnings. The storm had hit earlier than expected, and roads were closing left and right. David gripped the steering wheel tighter and slowed, down even more. The last thing he needed was to become another accident statistic. That's when he saw it. At first, it looked like a shadow in the swirling snow, but as he got closer, his heart sank. Fresh tire tracks led straight off the highway and down a steep hill. Someone had lost control and gone over the edge. David pulled over and grabbed his flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing a car that had rolled several times before coming to rest against a large pine tree. Smoke was rising from the engine, and he could smell gasoline in the cold air. His training kicked in immediately. This was bad, really bad. Most people would have called 911 and waited for help. That would have been the smart thing to do. The safe thing. But David knew that in weather like this, it could take an hour or more for a rescue team to arrive, and that smoke from the engine meant time was running out fast. He ran back to his truck and grabbed his emergency kit and a length of rope he kept for situations just like this. Well, not exactly like this. He'd never had to rappel down an icy mountainside in a blizzard before. The wind was howling so loud he could barely hear himself think. Each step down the slope was treacherous. The snow was knee-deep in some places, and the ice underneath made every movement dangerous. David had to use the rope to keep from sliding down the mountain himself. As he got closer to the wreckage, he could see someone inside the car. An elderly woman was slumped over the steering wheel, unconscious. Blood trickled down her forehead, and her breathing was shallow and labored. The driver's side door was completely crushed, but the passenger side might work. David tried the handle, but it was jammed tight. The car had taken a beating during its tumble down the hill, and the frame was twisted in ways that made his stomach turn. He looked closer at the engine. The smoke was getting thicker, and he could see small flames starting to lick at something under the hood. His paramedic training told him he had maybe 10 minutes before this whole situation became much worse. David had a choice to make. He could climb back up the hill, call for help, and hope the professionals arrived in time. Or he could risk everything to try to save a complete stranger. He didn't even hesitate. Using a small pry bar from his emergency kit, David worked to bend the passenger door frame just enough to get it open. The metal groaned and complained, but finally gave way. The woman inside was in rough shape. Besides the head wound, he could see that her left arm was bent at an unnatural angle, and she was breathing in a way that suggested possible internal injuries. David had treated thousands of patients over the years, but never like this. Never. Alone on a mountainside with a car that might explode at any moment. His hands were shaking, partly from the cold and partly from adrenaline, but his training kept him focused. He checked her pulse first. Weak but steady. That was something. Her pupils were unequal in size, which worried him. Possible brain injury. The head wound needed immediate attention, but moving her could make things worse if she had spinal damage. The flames under the hood were getting bigger now. David could feel the heat even through the broken windshield. He had to make a decision fast. He grabbed his medical bag and pulled out everything he might need. Bandages, a neck brace, pain medication. Working as quickly and carefully as he could, David stabilized the woman's head and neck, then wrapped her head wound to stop the bleeding. The hard part was getting her out of the car. David had to be incredibly careful not to cause more damage while also working fast enough to get them both to safety before the car caught fire completely. He managed to slide the woman out of the passenger seat and onto a makeshift stretcher he created using his jacket and the rope. Every movement had to be precise. One wrong step on the icy slope and they'd both go tumbling down the mountain. The climb back up to the road was the longest 10 minutes of David's life. The woman was unconscious the entire time, which was probably a blessing. David slipped twice, nearly losing his grip on the rope, but somehow managed to keep them both moving upward. Just as they reached the road, David heard a sound that made his blood run cold. A loud whoosh followed by the crackle of flames. He turned around to see the car fully engulfed in fire. They had made it out just in time. David carried the woman to his truck and laid her gently in the back seat. His hands were numb from the cold, and his whole body was shaking from exhaustion and adrenaline. But his job wasn't done yet. He still had to get her to a hospital, and in this storm, that wasn't going to be easy. As he started driving, David glanced in the rearview mirror at his unconscious passenger. He didn't know who she was or where she'd been going. All he knew was that she needed help, and he'd been in the right place at the right time to provide it. The drive to the hospital was treacherous, but David's years of emergency driving experience served him well. He radioed ahead to let them know he was coming in with a critical patient, giving them all the medical details he'd observed during the rescue. About halfway to the hospital, the woman stirred slightly and mumbled something David couldn't quite make out. She seemed to be trying to thank him, but the words were slurred and weak. David told her to save her strength and that everything was going to be okay. He had no idea that this chance encounter in a snowstorm would change both of their lives forever. The hospital emergency room was buzzing with activity when David burst through the doors. Snow covered his jacket, and his hands were still shaking from the cold and adrenaline. Behind him, 2 nurses quickly wheeled the elderly woman into the trauma bay. "What do we have?" Dr. Rodriguez asked, pulling on her gloves as she approached the stretcher. David rattled off everything he'd observed during the rescue. Head trauma, possible internal bleeding, broken arm, and signs of shock. He'd done what he could at the accident scene, but this woman needed serious medical attention fast. As the medical team took over, David stepped back and watched them work. This was always the hardest part of his job, handing over a patient, and hoping he'd done enough to keep them alive until the real help arrived. The woman's vital signs were weak but stable. Her blood pressure was low, which worried everyone in the room. Dr. Rodriguez ordered blood work, X-rays, and a CT scan of her head. The next few hours would be critical. David gave his official report to the attending physician, then filled out the necessary paperwork. His shift had ended hours ago, but he couldn't bring himself to leave. Something about this rescue felt different. Maybe it was because he'd risked so much to save her, or maybe it was the way she'd tried to thank him. In the truck. Around 3 in the morning, Dr. Rodriguez found David in the waiting room, still in his snow-covered uniform. "Your patient is stable," she said, sitting down beside him. "You saved her life out there. If you'd arrived even 10 minutes later, we probably would have lost her." David felt a wave of relief wash over him. "Will she be okay?" "She's got a long road ahead. Severe concussion, 3 broken ribs, and that arm will need surgery. But she's tough. Tougher than most people her age." The doctor paused. "There's something else, though. We can't find any identification on her. No purse, no wallet, nothing." The car was registered to a rental company. This wasn't unusual in David's line of work. Sometimes people got hurt and couldn't remember who they were or where they came from. Head injuries could do that. But something about this situation felt different. "Has she said anything?" David asked. "She's been in and out of consciousness. Keeps asking for someone named Thomas, but other than that, nothing useful." Dr. Rodriguez stood up. "Go home and get some rest. You've done your part." But David couldn't sleep when he finally got home. He kept thinking about the woman lying in that hospital bed with no one to call, no one to worry about her. The storm was still raging outside, and he wondered where she'd been going when she crashed. The next morning, David called the hospital to check on her condition. She was awake and asking questions, which was a good sign. Against his better judgment, he decided to stop by during his lunch break. When he walked into her room, the woman's face lit up with recognition. "You're the angel who saved me," she said, her voice still weak but clear. David laughed. "I'm no angel, just a paramedic who happened to be in the right place at the right time." The woman studied his face carefully. "You risked your life for a complete stranger. In my book, that makes you an angel." They talked for about 20 minutes. The woman still couldn't remember much about the accident or what she'd been doing on that mountain road. The doctor said her memory might come back gradually or it might not come back at all. "I keep having dreams about someone named Thomas," she told David. "I think he might be important, but I can't remember who he is." David felt sorry for her. Imagine waking up in a hospital with no memory of how you got there or who you were supposed to call. It had to be terrifying. Over the next few days, David found himself stopping by the hospital more often than he probably should have. The woman, who'd started going by the name Eleanor since she couldn't remember her real one, seemed to enjoy his visits. She was different from most patients David had encountered. Despite her injuries and memory loss, she had this calm wisdom about her. She asked thoughtful questions about his work, his dreams, and his life outside the ambulance. "You're young," she told him during one visit. "Do you plan to be a paramedic forever?" David had been thinking about that a lot lately. "I love helping people, but sometimes I wonder if I could do more. Maybe open a clinic in a neighborhood where people can't afford to go to the doctor." Eleanor's eyes lit up when he said this. "That's a beautiful dream. What's stopping you?" "Money. Mostly. And experience. I'm good at emergency medicine, but running a clinic is completely different. The best doctors I've ever known started with a dream and figured out the rest as they went along," Eleanor said. "Don't let fear stop you from helping people." There was something about the way she said it that made David think she knew more about medicine than she was letting on. But every time he asked about her background, she'd change the subject or say she couldn't remember. By the end of the week, Eleanor was well enough to be discharged. The hospital had arranged for her to stay in a nearby hotel until her memory returned or someone came looking for her. The police were still investigating, but so far, no missing person reports matched her description. David offered to drive her to the hotel, and she accepted gratefully. As they pulled up to the building, Eleanor turned to him with tears in her eyes. "I don't know how I'll ever repay you for what you've done," she said. "You don't need to repay me," David replied. "Just get better and try to remember who you are. Someone out there is probably worried sick about you." Eleanor nodded, but something in her expression suggested she knew more than she was saying. As David watched her walk into the hotel, he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end of their story. He had no idea how right he was. 3 days passed before David heard from Eleanor again. He'd been thinking about her quite a bit, wondering how she was adjusting to life in the hotel with no memories and no family to call. So when his phone rang that Tuesday morning, he was surprised to hear the hospital administrator on the other end. "David, this is Patricia from General Hospital. We need you to come in today if possible. It's about the patient you rescued during the storm." "Is Eleanor okay? Did something happen to her?" "She's fine, but there are some unusual circumstances. We need to discuss with you. She's been asking to see you specifically, and frankly, we have some questions ourselves." David's mind raced with possibilities. Had Eleanor remembered something important? Was she in some kind of trouble? He told Patricia he'd be there within the hour. When David arrived at the hospital, he immediately noticed something different. There were more security guards than usual, and they seemed to be paying special attention to the 3rd floor where Eleanor had been staying. Patricia met him at the front desk with a puzzled expression. "Before you go up to see her, I need to tell you what's been happening," she said, leading him to a quiet corner. Yesterday morning, we started getting phone calls, lots of them. People asking if we had treated an elderly woman with specific injuries matching Eleanor's description. That's good news, right? Maybe someone's looking for her. Patricia shook her head. These weren't family members or friends. They were reporters, government officials, and people claiming to represent various medical organizations. When we told them we couldn't give out patient information, some of them got very persistent. David felt a chill run down his spine. What kind of government officials? That's just it. We don't know. They wouldn't say exactly who they were or why they were looking for her. And then this morning, Eleanor's room started filling up with flowers and cards from all over the world. People we've never heard of, sending messages in different languages. They took the elevator up to the 3rd floor, and David could see what Patricia meant. 2 security guards stood outside Eleanor's door, and there were several well-dressed people having quiet conversations in the hallway. David recognized one of them as Dr. Williams, the hospital's chief of staff, but the others were strangers. Has anyone asked Eleanor about all this? David wondered. That's another strange thing. When we showed her some of the cards and letters, she just smiled and said people were being very kind. She acted like it was perfectly normal to receive international mail from complete strangers. David knocked on Eleanor's door and heard her cheerful voice calling him in. When he entered, his jaw dropped. The room looked like a flower shop. Bouquets covered every available surface, and cards were stacked on the bedside table in neat piles. David! Eleanor's face lit up when she saw him. I'm so glad you came. How have you been? I should be asking you that question, he said, gesturing around the room. What's all this about? Eleanor waved her hand dismissively. People heard about the accident and wanted to send their well wishes. Isn't it wonderful how kind strangers can be? But David noticed something in her eyes. The same look she got whenever he asked about her past, like she was hiding something important. Eleanor, the hospital staff is getting calls from reporters and government people. They're all looking for you. Don't you think that's a little strange? For someone with amnesia? Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, arranging some flowers in a vase. Sometimes when people hear about accidents, they think they might know the person involved. It's probably just a misunderstanding. David wasn't buying it. Over the past week, he'd gotten to know Eleanor pretty well. She was incredibly smart, well-spoken, and seemed to know a lot about medicine and world events for someone who couldn't. Remember her own name? There's something else, he said, pulling out his phone. I've been getting some strange looks at work. Yesterday, one of the doctors asked me detailed questions about your rescue. Not medical questions, personal ones. Like where exactly I found you and whether you said anything specific during the drive to the hospital. Eleanor's expression grew, more serious. What did you tell them? The truth. That you were unconscious most of the time and only mumbled a few words I couldn't understand. David sat down in the chair beside her bed. But Eleanor, I get the feeling you remember more than you're letting on. She looked at him for a long time, as if she were making an important decision. Finally, she spoke. David. What would you do? If you discovered that someone you cared about wasn't exactly who they appeared to be? I guess that would depend on whether they were a good person or not, he answered honestly. And how would you judge that? By their actions or by their reputation? David thought about it. By their actions, definitely. Anyone can have a reputation, good or bad, but actions show who someone really is. Eleanor smiled at this answer. You saved my life without knowing anything about me except that I needed help. That tells me everything I need to know about your character. What are you trying to say, Eleanor? Before she could answer, there was a knock on the door. Dr. Williams entered with 2 of the well-dressed strangers David had seen in the hallway. Eleanor, these gentlemen would like to speak with you privately, Dr. Williams said. They've shown proper identification and have some questions about your situation. Eleanor looked at David meaningfully. I think it's time for me to check out of this hotel and find somewhere quieter to recover. David, Would you mind giving me a ride? The two strangers exchanged glances. One of them stepped forward. Ma'am, we really need to verify your identity and discuss some security concerns. I appreciate your concern, Eleanor said politely but firmly. But I'm not under arrest and I'm free to leave whenever I choose. Isn't that correct, Dr. Williams? The doctor nodded reluctantly. You're right, of course. But these gentlemen have suggested that there might be safety issues. I'll be perfectly safe with David, Eleanor said, gathering her few belongings. He's already proven he's willing to risk his life to protect me. 20 minutes later, David found himself driving Eleanor away from the hospital with more questions than answers. She directed him to an upscale hotel across town, where she apparently had a reservation waiting under a different name. As they pulled up to the elegant building, David turned to her. Eleanor, I don't know what's going on, but I want you to know that whatever your story is, I'm glad I was there to help you that night. She reached over and squeezed his hand. You have no idea how much that means to me, David. More than you'll ever know. As he watched her disappear into the hotel lobby, David couldn't shake the feeling that he'd just become part of something much bigger than a simple car accident rescue. He had no idea how right he was. Over the next 2 weeks, David found himself meeting Eleanor for coffee almost every day. She'd chosen a small cafe near the downtown library, away from the busy hospital district. It was quiet, cozy, and perfect for the long conversations they'd started having. Eleanor was fascinating to talk with. She knew so much about medicine, world history, and different cultures. When David mentioned his dream of opening a free clinic, her eyes would light up with genuine interest. She asked detailed questions about his plans, offering suggestions that showed a deep understanding of healthcare systems. You know, she said one afternoon over her usual herbal tea, the most successful medical programs I've seen always start with someone who truly cares about helping people, not making money. Have you seen many medical programs? David asked, curious about her background again. Eleanor paused, stirring her tea thoughtfully. I suppose I must have, though I still can't remember exactly where or when. But David was starting to notice things, small details that didn't quite add up. Eleanor spoke multiple languages fluently. He'd heard her chatting with the Italian waiter in perfect Italian, and she'd helped translate a Spanish medical document he'd brought from work. She also seemed to know an awful lot about international medical research for someone with amnesia. One day, David arrived at the cafe to find Eleanor reading a thick medical journal. She looked up guiltily when she saw him, quickly closing the magazine. Light reading? He joked, sitting down across from her. I found it in the library. Some of it seemed familiar, though I'm not sure why. She looked uncomfortable, like she'd been caught doing something she shouldn't. David decided to test something. There's this new treatment for rare blood diseases. That's been in the news lately. Something about gene therapy. Have you heard about it? Eleanor's face immediately became animated. Oh yes, that's fascinating work. The key breakthrough was figuring out how to target specific cell types without affecting healthy tissue. The research team spent years perfecting the delivery method, and now they're seeing remarkable results in patients who had no other options. She stopped mid-sentence, realizing she'd revealed far more knowledge than someone with memory loss should have. David stared at her. Eleanor, that research was just published last month, and you just described it like you were personally involved in developing it. Eleanor's hands trembled slightly as she reached for her tea. I must have read about it somewhere. Where? You've been in the hospital or that hotel for weeks. When would you have had time to study cutting-edge medical research in such detail? For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Eleanor looked out the window, seeming to wrestle with some internal decision. Finally, she turned back to David with tears in her eyes. David, there's something I need to tell you, but first, I need you to promise me something. What? Promise me that no matter what you learn about me, You'll judge me based on the person you've gotten to know these past few weeks, not on anything else you might hear. David felt his heart racing. Eleanor, you're scaring me. What's going on? Promise me first. Okay, I promise. But please, just tell me the truth. Eleanor took a deep breath. My memory isn't gone, David. I remember everything about that night, about my life, about who I am. I've been lying to you from the beginning. David felt like he'd been punched in the stomach. Why? Why would you lie to me? Because I needed to know what kind of person you really were. When you saved me that night, you risked everything for a complete stranger. But I've learned that people sometimes act differently when they know who I am. They want things from me, or they treat me like I'm not a real person. Who are you, Eleanor? She reached into her purse and pulled out a passport. David looked at the name and felt his world shift. Dr. Eleanor Whitfield. Even David, who didn't follow medical news closely, recognized that name. You're the Nobel Prize winner. The doctor who developed treatments for those rare diseases we were just talking about. Eleanor nodded. Among other things, yes. David's mind raced. Dr. Eleanor Whitfield was a legend in the medical world. She'd spent decades working in war zones and disaster areas, treating patients that other doctors had given up on. Her research had saved thousands of lives, and her humanitarian work had taken her to some of the most dangerous places on Earth. But why were you driving alone on that mountain road? And why didn't you tell anyone who you were? Eleanor's expression grew sad. I was visiting Thomas, my husband. He died 3 years ago, and he's buried in a small cemetery up in the mountains. I go there every year on our anniversary, but I always travel quietly. I don't like the media attention. So when you crashed, I made a split-second decision to hide my identity. I wanted to see if the people treating me were genuinely kind or just impressed by my reputation. And then, when I met you, she smiled through her tears. You were so genuine, so caring. You treated me like a real person, not like some famous doctor. David felt a mix of emotions, confusion, betrayal, but also understanding. All those government people looking for you? They were worried when I didn't return home as scheduled. My foundation has projects running in 12 countries. When I disappeared, a lot of people got concerned. And the flowers and cards? Word got out somehow that I'd been in an accident. The medical community is smaller than you might think. People I've worked with over the years wanted to make sure I was okay. David sat back in his chair, trying to process everything. So what happens now? Eleanor leaned forward, her eyes intense. That depends on you, David. I've spent the past 2 weeks getting to know the man who saved my life, and I'm more impressed now than I was that first night. You have a dream of helping people, and you have the heart to make it happen. What are you saying? I'm saying that maybe we could help each other. You want to open a clinic to serve people who can't afford medical care. I have resources and connections that could make that dream a reality. But more than that, I have experience in exactly the kind of work you want to do. David's head was spinning. You'd want to work with me? After I'm just a paramedic? David, you're not just anything. You're someone who risked his life to save. A stranger in a blizzard. You're someone who visits lonely patients in the hospital even when you're not working. You're someone who dreams of helping people instead of getting rich. Eleanor reached across the table and took his hand. Those are exactly the qualities that make the best doctors and the most effective humanitarian workers. But I lied to you about my identity, she continued. I understand if you can't trust me anymore. David thought about everything Eleanor had told him. Yes, she'd lied about her memory, but she'd done it to protect herself and to see his true character. And in all their conversations, everything else she'd shared about her values and beliefs had been completely genuine. I'm not angry about the lie, he said finally. I understand why you did it. But I need to know, is Eleanor Whitfield really the person I've been having coffee with these past 2 weeks? Eleanor smiled, and for the first time since he'd known her, it reached all the way to her eyes. She's exactly who you've been having coffee with, David. The only difference is that now you know why I understand so much about the kind of work you want to do. As they sat in that small cafe, David realized that his life was about to change in ways he'd never imagined. The woman he'd saved in a snowstorm wasn't just grateful. She was offering to help him turn his biggest dream into reality. 6 months later, David stood in front of a building that still didn't feel real to him. The sign above the door read, Second Chance Medical Center, and below it, in smaller letters, Free Healthcare for All. It had been the fastest 6 months of his life. After Eleanor revealed her true identity, everything had moved at lightning speed. She'd introduced him to architects, medical equipment suppliers, and a whole network of doctors who believed in providing health care to underserved communities. But it wasn't just about the money or connections. Eleanor had become his mentor, teaching him things about medicine and patient care that he'd never learned in paramedic training. She'd spent decades working in places where resources were limited and creativity was essential. The first rule of community medicine, she'd told him during one of their planning sessions, is that every patient teaches you something new. Stay humble and keep learning. The clinic had started as David's dream, but it had become something much bigger. Eleanor had suggested they focus not just on treating emergencies, but on preventive care and health education. She'd helped him design programs to train local residents in basic first aid and CPR. If you teach people to help each other, she'd explained, you multiply your impact far beyond what one clinic can do. On opening day, David was nervous. What if nobody came? What if he wasn't ready for this kind of responsibility? But Eleanor, who'd been working alongside him every day for months, seemed completely confident. You saved my life when I was a complete stranger, she reminded him. You'll do just fine taking care of people who really need your help. The first patient through the door was Mrs. Rodriguez, an elderly woman who lived 3 blocks away. She'd been putting off getting her blood pressure checked because she couldn't afford to go to a regular doctor. Is it really free? She asked David, looking suspicious. Completely free, David assured her. That's what we're here for. As David checked her blood pressure, Mrs. Rodriguez told him about her grandson who wanted to become a paramedic. Eleanor overheard and joined the conversation, sharing stories about young medical students she'd mentored over the years. By the end of the first week, word had spread throughout the neighborhood. People started coming in for checkups, vaccinations, and treatment for minor injuries. David was amazed at how much need there was in just a few square blocks. But the real test came 3 weeks after opening, during David's first major emergency, at the clinic. A construction worker had been brought in with severe chest pain, and David suspected a heart attack. The nearest hospital was 20 minutes away by ambulance. Eleanor watched as David quickly assessed the patient, started an IV, and administered medication to stabilize him before transport. She saw the calm confidence he'd developed, the way he communicated with both the patient and the ambulance crew. You found your calling, she told him later that evening as they locked up the clinic. I learned from the best, David replied. Eleanor shook her head. I didn't teach you compassion, David. That was already there. I just helped you find new ways to use it. As winter approached, marking almost a year since their first meeting, the clinic had become an essential part of the community. David had trained 15 local residents in basic first aid. 3 high school students were volunteering after school, inspired to consider careers in medicine. Eleanor had officially come out of retirement to work at the clinic full-time. She loved being back to hands-on patient care after years of research and administrative work. I'd forgotten how rewarding it is to directly help people, she told David one afternoon as they reviewed patient files. You reminded me why I became a doctor in the first place. The clinic's success had attracted attention from medical schools and public health organizations. David found himself giving presentations about their community-based model, something he never would have imagined doing a year ago. But the moment that meant the most to him came on a snowy December evening. David was working late when he heard a knock on the clinic door. He opened it to find a young woman holding a baby. "Are you the doctor who helps people for free?" she asked. "I'm a paramedic, but yes, we help anyone who needs it," David replied, letting her in from the cold. The baby had a fever and the mother was scared. She'd lost her job 2 months ago and couldn't afford to take her child to the emergency room. David examined the baby carefully, determined it was just a minor viral infection, and showed the mother how to keep the child comfortable. "How much do I owe you?" she asked as they prepared to leave. "Nothing," David said. "Just take good care of that beautiful baby." As he watched them walk into the snowy night, David thought about Eleanor's words from months earlier. Every patient did teach him something new. Tonight, he'd learned that the work he was doing mattered more than he'd ever realized. Eleanor emerged from the back office where she'd been organizing medical supplies. "Another successful house call?" she asked, noticing David's thoughtful expression. "Something like that." David looked around the clinic they'd built together. "Eleanor, can I ask you something?" "Of course." "That night when you crashed, do you ever wonder what would have happened if I hadn't been driving by?" Eleanor was quiet for a moment. "I try not to think about that, but I do think about what would have happened if you'd just called for help and waited instead of climbing down that mountain yourself." "What do you mean?" "I mean that everything good that's happened since then, this clinic, the people we've helped, the lives we've changed, it all started with your decision to risk everything for a stranger." Eleanor smiled. "Some people spend their whole lives looking for their purpose. You found yours on a snowy mountain road." As they turned off the lights and locked up the clinic for the night, David reflected on how much his life had changed. A year ago, he'd been a paramedic with a dream. Now he was running a medical clinic, training community volunteers, and working alongside one of the most respected doctors in the world. But the most important thing hadn't changed at all. He was still helping people who needed it most. He was still the same person who'd risk everything to save a stranger in a storm. The only difference was that now he had the resources and knowledge to help even more people. And it all started with one moment of choosing kindness over safety, compassion over convenience. As David drove home through the gently falling snow, he smiled. Sometimes the most ordinary decisions lead to the most extraordinary outcomes. Sometimes saving one life changes everything. And sometimes, when you're willing to risk everything for a stranger, you discover that the stranger was exactly who you needed to meet.